2024 was a big year for ultra short throw projectors, and in this video I've got 12 new and upcoming USTs ranging from the $1,500 Optima GT3500 HDR all the way up to the brand new $6,000 Samsung Premier LPU9D. And we're going to measure their brightness, contrast, and color. Then we'll put them head to head in both a dark theater room environment and then again with the lights on. We'll measure their input lag and fan noise. We'll test their focus, sharpness, RBE, and 24p motion handling. And last, we'll look at 3D performance and speaker quality. And that's a lot of stuff to go over, so feel free to use the timestamps, and links for all the projectors are down in the description. The least expensive projector that we'll be testing today is the $1,500 Optima GT3500 HDR. Then for $2,000, we've got the new Nexigo Aurora Light, and also for $2,000 is the Hisense PL1. After that, for $2,200 is the new Formovie Edge. Then for $2,300 is the AWOL LTV 2500. After that is the Epson LS650 for $2,500. Then the Nexigo Aurora Pro is $2,700. The XGME Aura 2 is also $2,700. The BENQ V5010i is $3,000. The brand new Hisense PX3-Pro is $3,500. The AWOL LTV 3500 Pro is $5,200, and the just released Samsung Premier LPU9D is the most expensive projector that we'll be testing at $6,000. To start out, I measured the brightness and contrast of each projector using my white and black test pattern that has a 50% moving gray box to prevent any full-on, full-off laser power tricks. And I measured every projector in a single session without moving the screen or the test probe to ensure the most consistent results. And the brightest projectors were the Epson LS650, which put out an insane 5,199 lumens on dynamic mode with that 100% test window. The Optima GT3500 HDR put out 3,822 lumens in bright mode, and the Hisense PX3-Pro measured 3,729 lumens when using its high output brightness enhancing mode. However, switching to more reasonably color accurate modes made the differences much less severe, with the PX3-Pro, Optima GT3500 HDR, Epson LS650, and AWOL LTV 3500 all coming in between 34 and 3500 peak lumens. I also used my Jetty 1501 high-res spectrometer with Calman Ultimate to measure which picture mode was the most color accurate out of the box, and then I measured the peak lumens on those modes, and I found that the Epson LS650 had the brightest color accurate mode at 3,441 lumens in cinema mode with a delta error of 5.65. The AWOL LTV 3500 Pro put out 2,990 lumens in movie mode, but it wasn't particularly color accurate with a DE of 11.92, and the Hisense PX3-Pro was much more impressive with 2,942 lumens in cinema mode with a DE of 4.75. I also measured both native and dynamic contrast if it was available, and I found that the Nexigo Aurora Pro had the highest native contrast ratio at 3,909 to 1, followed by the Nexigo Aurora Light at 3,632 to 1. The Hisense PX3-Pro measured 3,616 to 1, and the Formovie Edge was also very good at 3,539 to 1. All the projectors except for the Formovie Edge, Hisense PL1, and BENQ V5010i had some form of dynamic contrast setting, and for those, the Hisense PX3-Pro came out on top with a dynamic contrast of 10,319 to 1. The Optima GT3500 HDR was at 9,990 to 1, and the Epson LS650 measured 9,694 to 1, but I try not to get too excited about those measurements because they very rarely show up in actual viewing. And in the case of both the Epson and the Optima, I can clearly see the lasers dimming, and I wouldn't personally choose to leave those settings on. Speaking of lasers, all the projectors in this year's video use laser light sources, but the Optima GT3500 HDR, Epson LS650, Formovie Edge, and Hisense PL1 are single laser projectors, while the Hisense PX3-Pro, Nexigo Aurora Pro, and Aurora Light, AWOL LTV 2500 and 3500, Samsung Premier, and BENQ V5010i are triple laser projectors, and the XGME Aura 2 is unique and it uses what they call the dual light system, which combines an RGB laser with a single laser phosphor wheel to try to get the best of both worlds. And the advantages of a single laser projector are that they have virtually zero laser speckle, but triple laser projectors have a wider color gamut and usually appear more vibrant. I used my Jetty 1501 to measure the color space coverage of each projector, and I found that for SDR content using the Rec 709 color space, All the triple laser projectors had 99% coverage or better, while the single lasers ranged from 99.6 on the Hisense PL1 all the way down to 88.7 on the Epson LS650. Measuring the HDR DCI-P3 color space, the triple lasers were all 96% or better, with the single lasers falling down into the 70% range, and for the widest BT2020 color space, the three newest projectors, the BENQ V5010i, Samsung Premier, and Hisense PX3-Pro, had the most coverage at above 97%, followed by the previous generation triple laser projectors from AWOL and Nexigo, and then the dual light source from XGIMI, and the single laser projectors were predictably at the bottom. And theoretically, all those brightness, contrast, and color measurements should combine together to translate into viewing experience. But in the past, I've seen more than a few instances where that doesn't happen. So to test viewing experience and picture quality, I set up the projectors side by side using two identical 100-inch Formovie Fresnel screens in my completely light-controlled garage. And prior to testing, I also performed a simple 2-point white balance calibration on each projector to account for the specific screens that I'm using. And then I put the projectors head to head from the least expensive to the most. And that meant that in round 1, the 1080p Optima GT3500 HDR is on the left, and the 4K Nexigo Aurora Light was on the right. And starting with bright SDR content, the Optima was just generally washed out and had pretty poor color accuracy. And that was also true in dark SDR scenes, but with the added complication of a pretty high black floor, leading to muddy shadows when dynamic contrast was disabled, and way too noticeable and aggressive dimming with dynamic contrast on. And you could easily see the laser power switch from normal to eco and back. As for HDR and Dolby Vision, I was actually pretty impressed with the tone mapping of the Optima, given that it was just using HDR10 instead of Dolby Vision. And I thought that the Nexigo Aurora Light was just a little bit too dim when viewing Wakanda Forever, though the colors and the black floor were definitely better on the Nexigo. And the Optima looked more like an SDR image than an HDR one. And last, this year to help visualize the relative contrast of each projector, I'm using shutter priority mode on my camera to allow it to automatically adjust the exposure to the point where the projector with the higher black floor will show up. And you can see that in this case it wasn't particularly close, with the Aurora Light having highlights that were just as bright but a much lower black floor, so all those things combined mean the Aurora Light easily moves on. So in round 2, the Hisense PL1 is on the left and the Nexigo Aurora Light is on the right. And during bright SDR content, I thought the Nexigo was slightly more color accurate, but I really enjoyed the tone mapping of the PL1. Unfortunately, it does seem like the aggressive tone mapping led to some strange artifacts and flashing as the camera switched back and forth between Henry and Danny. During dark scenes though, the Aurora Light's black floor was noticeably better than the PL1, but the extra brightness and crazy tone mapping of the PL1 made it look much more eye-catching. During Dolby Vision content, the PL1's tone mapping was also more dramatic, but unfortunately it had significant color banding in bright areas that I wasn't able to fix by changing the HDMI settings like I can on my Hisense C1. And last, in the contrast demonstration, you can see that the Nexigo's black floor was significantly lower, and even the black bars on the bottom and top of the PL1 screen were brighter than the blacks in the Nexigo's main image. So although I really liked the tone mapping on the PL1, the color banding, processing artifacts, and black floor prevented it from getting the win. And that means that round 3 is the Formovie Edge on the left and the Nexigo Aurora Light on the right. And the thing that immediately stuck out to me was how saturated the image was on the Formovie Edge, and not necessarily in a bad way. The Aurora Light was definitely more color accurate, and Danny's skin in particular looked much more natural to me, but I did really like the tone mapping and brightness of the Formovie Edge, and it didn't have that same strange flashing that the PL1 had. And in dark scenes, the highlights on the Formovie were noticeably brighter, making the image look higher contrast despite a raised black floor when compared to the Nexigo. And I really found myself wishing for a little bit more brightness on the Aurora Light to help with all those highlights. And just like the Optima from round 1, I was impressed by the Formovie's tone mapping during Wakanda Forever, despite only having HDR10 and not Dolby Vision. And although the color temperature was still clearly too cool even when set to warm, the image was generally excellent and a pleasure to watch in both Wakanda Forever and Our Planet Season 2 Episode 1. So although the black floor on the Formovie Edge was quite a bit higher than the Nexigo Aurora Light, I still preferred it overall, so the Formovie moved on. And that meant that in round 4, the Formovie Edge was on the left and the AWOL LTV2500 was on the right. And in bright SDR content, the LTV2500 was slightly too red, which then exaggerated the Formovie's color inaccuracy, which was slightly too green. And in bright scenes, I think I preferred the LTV2500, but in dark scenes, the AWOL was absolutely betrayed by its high black floor. And even with AWOL's enhanced black level mode set to on, dark scenes on the AWOL just looked completely washed out next to the Formovie Edge. And unfortunately, Dolby Vision content was even more of a struggle, and unlike the LTV3500 that makes up for its high black floor with eye-searing highlights, the LTV2500 just looked washed out and dull. And if you remember how much lower the black floor on the Nexigo was from the previous round, the difference between the Formovie Edge and the AWOL LTV2500 this round was even more. So the Formovie easily moves on again. Round 5 then put the Formovie Edge on the left and the Epson LS650 on the right, and the Epson was so bright. This was in cinema mode with color temp set to 8 and the brightness at 50%, and it was still difficult to find camera settings that could properly expose the Formovie without overexposing the Epson. But during SDR content, the Epson's tone mapping and color accuracy were not what I would call a cinema experience, but they were very easy to watch, and I was only occasionally jolted out of enjoying the experience by the very muddy and gray black levels. But for the most part, the contrast was still decent enough due to the brightness of the highlights. I was also impressed by the HDR10 tone mapping on the Epson during Wakanda Forever, and I thought that both the color accuracy and saturation were absolutely on point. So I was able to look past those poor black levels and move the Epson on to the next round. So in round 6, the XGIMI Aura 2 was on the left and the Epson LS650 was on the right. And if you've ever struggled with eye strain or fatigue after watching a screen for a long period of time, the XGIMI Aura 2 might be the right pick for you. And it's hard to describe, but it was definitely very comfortable to watch in both light and dark scenes in a pitch black room. And actually the LS650 and Aura 2 are both very similar in that way in that they are very comfortable to watch. But all the things that I liked about the Epson from the previous round, like the good color accuracy and aggressive tone mapping, seemed to be even better on the Aura 2, but with the added bonus of Dolby Vision support and a slightly lower, albeit very raised black floor. So the Aura 2 moves on to the next round. And that makes round 7 the XGIMI Aura 2 on the left and last year's darkroom winner, the Nexigo Aurora Pro, on the right. And more than any other round, this matchup wasn't close. The XGIMI's Dual Light 2.0 system films really well, making this round look closer than it was, but the Aurora Pro's contrast was absolutely ridiculous compared to every other projector so far. And even in the bright scenes, I felt like the black levels of the Aurora Pro allowed for more shadow detail without needing to raise the gamma of the entire scene. And while I definitely wouldn't write off the Aura 2 or LS650 for easy casual viewing in a room with some ambient light or bias lighting behind the screen, the Nexigo Aurora Pro provides that dramatic contrast and black level that's typically associated with the home theater experience. And when paired with an ambient light rejecting screen, the Aurora Pro challenges projectors that cost 5 times as much. Round 8 was then the BENQ V5010i on the left and the Nexigo Aurora Pro on the right, and in bright SDR content, the BENQ looked excellent with good highlights and overall brightness. And like the XGIMI Aura 2, the BENQ filmed really well, but in person the color was a little bit too green during the bright scenes, and during dark scenes the lack of a dynamic black mode made it really hard to compete with the Aurora Pro, which practically looked like an OLED next to the BENQ. During Dolby Vision content, the BENQ's tone mapping was extremely aggressive, and I didn't hate it, but during some scenes it led to some strange digital noise being inserted into the darkest areas. But given its 0.252 nit black floor, the BENQ was definitely playing into its high peak brightness in an attempt to compensate for a low black floor. And as I said, I didn't hate it, but for a darkroom experience, the Nexigo is definitely the better pick. So round 9 then put the Hisense PX3-Pro on the left and the Nexigo Aurora Pro on the right in the matchup that I was most excited for after measuring the 10,000 to 1 dynamic contrast ratio of the Hisense. But unfortunately that dynamic contrast didn't really show up in real content. And even though the PX3-Pro had a measured black floor of 0.036 nits compared to 0.044 nits on the Aurora Pro, during Gemini Man the black floor was slightly but noticeably higher on the PX3-Pro. And it also had a slightly blue tint to it when compared to the Nexigo Aurora Pro. Now the other part of contrast ratio is the peak brightness, and that part did show up, with bright scenes really favoring the PX3-Pro, especially in Dolby Vision content. But color accuracy and white balance seemed ever so slightly better on the Nexigo. I definitely went back and forth in this round a bunch of times, and I ultimately decided to leave it up to the black floor test, and you can see how close that test was also, but the blacks on the Nexigo were slightly darker, giving it the win for this round. But this is definitely the closest that any projector has ever come to besting the Nexigo, and I still think it could have gone either way. So in round 10, the AWOL LTV 3500 Pro is on the left, and the Nexigo Aurora Pro is on the right. And I went through all the motions in this round, but I've compared these projectors side by side 3 times now, and the outcome is always the same. Much like the BENQ, the AWOL plays into its strengths, and the highlights are often so bright that you don't notice the poor black floor. During bright SDR content, my eye always favors the AWOL, but once shadows get added to that equation, the dynamic black mode of the Aurora Pro makes it far superior, and the same holds true through all content types. And the black floor test between the LTV 3500 and the Aurora Pro is one of the most dramatic that we've seen. But it's also the first time that we've seen a noticeable difference in the brightness between the highlights, and they're actually so bright on the LTV 3500 Pro that they get overexposed by the camera. Still, the Aurora Pro is definitely the way to go for a dark room, so in this final round, the Samsung Premier LPU 9D is on the left, and the Nexigo Aurora Pro is on the right. And in bright SDR content, I thought the Samsung was a little bit too green, but the tone mapping did an excellent job of not crushing shadow details or blowing out any of the highlights. And there was some extra detail visible in the painted hand railing that hadn't really shown up in any of the other projectors. However, in dark scenes, the Samsung was not good. Highlights were muted and shadows were raised, leading to a pretty low overall dynamic range, and that combined with the much higher black levels on the Samsung made for some of the worst dark scene performance yet. And for purely political reasons, Samsung decided to not include Dolby Vision compatibility in their $6,000 projector, so I did test it with HDR10 Plus instead, and the Aurora Pro was orders of magnitude better during Oppenheimer due to the elevated black floor on the Samsung, which was also extremely apparent in the contrast test. So without question, the top two projectors for darkroom viewing were the Nexigo Aurora Pro and the Hisense PX3-Pro. And honestly, it could have gone either way as to which one was the best, but my preference was personally towards the Aurora Pro's better black levels and slightly reduced brightness. And as for the rest of the rankings, the name of the game was tone mapping, and I thought that the BENQ, AWOL LTV 3500, and XGME Aura were better than the rest, but if your room is really dark, I think the Nexigo Aurora Light does need to be a little bit higher up on this list. For me though, it just didn't have enough brightness to make the highlights pop. When evaluating their bright room performance, I didn't worry much about D65 white point, and I wasn't overly concerned with their color accuracy. I just set the projectors to their brightest mode, I put on some sports, and as the kids would say, I let them eat. And in round one, I expected the Optima GT3500 HDR on the left to do very well with its ridiculously high peak brightness. And compared to the Nexigo Aurora Light on the right, it absolutely deserved to win. But I did think that the colors on the Optima looked a little bit gross in bright mode. But unfortunately, switching it to vivid mode lost enough brightness that it wasn't worth the extra color accuracy. And in round two, the Optima GT3500 HDR was on the left and the Hisense PL1 was on the right. And to me, the extra clarity from the Hisense and super saturated colors made it a pretty easy pick. Then in round three, the Formovie Edge was on the left and the Hisense PL1 was on the right. And during golf, the extra brightness of the Formovie Edge was definitely appreciated. And during football, I thought they were mostly equal, so the Formovie Edge moved on. Round four then had the Formovie Edge on the left and the AWOL LTV 2500 on the right. And despite the triple laser light source, the LTV 2500's image seemed strangely washed out when compared to the single laser Formovie Edge. And the clarity was very similar between the two, meaning this was another pretty easy win for the Formovie Edge. Round five then had the Formovie Edge on the left and the Epson LS650 on the right in dynamic mode, maximum brightness. And it was incredible. This is a 100-inch screen in a well-lit room, and it was brighter than most TVs. And despite all that brightness, it was still decently color accurate, and it easily won this round. So round six then put the Nexigo Aurora Pro on the left and the Epson LS650 on the right. And in a room with the lights on, the black floor means nothing, and the LS650 still looked insane. Last year I tested the Epson LS800, which is supposed to be the upgrade from the 650, but I firmly believe that the 650 is brighter when it's in dynamic mode. So in round seven I put the XGME Aura 2 on the left and the Epson LS650 on the right, and even though the Aura 2 looked good, it was just no match for the LS650, which again was as bright or brighter than most large-scale TVs that I've seen. Round 8 was the BENQ V5010i on the left and the Epson LS650 on the right, and the V5010i was definitely more color accurate, but like the AWOL LTV 2500, the colors looked almost dirty next to the very bright and very saturated LS650. And even though the BENQ got closer than most to knocking out the LS650, it was still an easy win for the Epson. Round 9 put the Hisense PX3-Pro on the left up against the Epson LS650 on the right, and I thought that this might be the round that knocked out the LS650. But even with the Hisense brightness enhancer turned on, the LS650 was very noticeably brighter, and despite the clarity of the PX3-Pro, there was no question that the LS650 still won this round. Round 10 was then the AWOL LTV 3500 Pro, last year's bright room winner on the left, versus the Epson LS650 on the right, and this round was close. It was easily the closest yet. The LTV 3500 Pro's colors were a little bit better in the white lettering, and the scoring graphics also looked a little bit whiter and a little bit clearer, but the LS650's brightness and motion handling were just too good, and the Epson took out the previous king for the last 2 years running. And that made the final round the Samsung Premier LPU9D on the left and the Epson LS650 on the right. And the Samsung has a little trick up its sleeve. Buried deep in the All Settings Expert options, there is a setting called Peak Brightness, and they were not kidding. The screen shuts off for a second, and then it turns back on to an eye-searing, ultra-saturated image, to the point where the scoreboard was completely blown out by my camera's settings. And combined with the increased sharpness of the DLP projection and the crisp MEMC movement, that meant that the Epson LS650 finally got taken out in the last round after a dominating performance from round 4 on. making these the final ranking for Lightroom performance. And I know that seems like it, but there's still a lot of stuff to measure and talk about, starting with input lag, which is important when you play video games on your projector. I measured input lag using the industry standard Leo Bodner lag tester, and I found that at 4K 60 Hz, the majority of the projectors were under the 20 millisecond mark, meaning that they would be excellent for all levels of gaming. While the Epson LS650 and the Formovie Edge were in the more casual gaming range, and the Samsung Premiere was just over that 50 millisecond mark, which is generally where things start to feel a little bit weird. At 1080p 120 Hz, about half of the projectors improved their input lag performance from their 4K 60 Hz numbers, with the Optima GT3500 HDR on top with just 8 milliseconds of input lag. And at 1080p 240 Hz, the Nexigo projectors, BENQ V5010i and Hisense PX3-Pro all had under 10 milliseconds of input lag, which is awesome to see. I also tested their fan noise, which can definitely be annoying during quiet movie scenes, and the Samsung Premiere LPU9D was completely silent, coming in at 36.3 decibels, which is the noise floor of my room. But to be honest, none of the projectors other than the LS650 were noticeable during actual viewing. And as you reduce the brightness on the LS650 using the remote, it automatically adjusts its fan noise. And I found that at around 70% brightness, the fan was very manageable at 41.3 decibels. And even at that brightness level, it was significantly brighter than most of the other projectors in the video. I also tested the focus uniformity and sharpness of each projector by setting up the projectors with 0 keystone and projecting this image onto the screen, and then taking individual pictures of each corner. And in this test, there was no question that the Samsung LPU9D was the sharpest UST on the market, with nearly perfect focus in all 4 corners, very little chromatic aberration, and 0 screen door effect as a result of using the larger 0.66-inch DLP chip. For the 0.47-inch chips, the Hisense PX3-Pro was definitely the best, with excellent sharpness and no chromatic aberration, and the Hisense PL1 had great focus, but with very slight blue fringing in the bottom right-hand corner. Both AWOL projectors had nearly perfect focus uniformity, but both the 2500 and 3500 had red fringing in the top and bottom right corners. The Formovie Edge was also very good with almost no color fringing, but a little bit of soft focus in the upper left and lower right. The BENQ had soft focus in the upper right and red fringing in all the corners. The Epson LS650 did as well as I've ever seen an Epson perform, with very little panel alignment issues, but the 3 LCD pixel shifting mechanism does lead to a less clear image when compared to DLP. The Optima GT3500 HDR was surprisingly sharp for a 1080p display, and other than a small amount of soft focus in the upper right corner, it looked very decent with no chromatic aberration. Both Nexigo projectors had soft focus in the upper left-hand corner, and I've heard that there is some unit-to-unit variation in focus among the Nexigos, and my Aurora Lite definitely had better focus than my Aurora Pro. And last, the XG Aurora 2 was surprisingly soft in all 4 corners when the center focus was dialed in all the way, but it had almost 0 chromatic aberration from its Dual Light 2.0 system. I also tested 24p motion handling using the ratings test, which, for those unfamiliar with that concept, most movies and shows are filmed in 24 frames per second, but most displays are 60 Hz. So they use something called 3-2 pull down to convert 24 frames per second into 30 frames per second. And the result is that alternating frames are displayed for different periods of time, and if you take a 1-second exposure of the ratings moving box, a 3-2 pull down will look like this. But if the display is capable of switching to 50 Hz, it will produce a more uniform image like this one. And I found that both the Nexigo Aurora Pro and Lite, AWOL LTV 2500 and 3500, BENQ V5010i, Samsung LPU9D, and Optima GT3500 HDR all had 24p modes that changed the frequency of the DMD to pass the ratings test, while the rest of the projectors relied on 3-2 pull down. But I will say that in 24p mode, while you won't notice motion judder caused by the uneven display times of alternating frames, you'll likely see motion stutter, and after a lot of experimentation, I've decided that I prefer having my Fire TV Max or Apple TV do the conversion rather than relying on MEMC on the projector or changing into 24p mode. But there's going to be a lot of person-to-person variation in that decision. And speaking of person-to-person variation, one of the most common things that I get asked about with DLP projectors is RBE, or the DLP Rainbow Effect, which is caused by the fact that each of the colors is projected consecutively rather than simultaneously. Some people are extremely sensitive to RBE, while others can't see it at all. And I'm somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But I've designed a sort of torture test that allows me to judge how much RBE each projector will produce. And I divided them up into 3 groups: low, medium, and high. And I found that the BENQ V5010i and Optima GT35 HDR had the most noticeable RBE. The Hisense PX3-Pro, Formovie Edge, XG Aurora 2, and Aurora Pro and Aurora Lite all had a very normal and typical amount of RBE, while the AWOL LTV 3500 Pro, AWOL 2500, Samsung LPU9D, and Hisense PL1 were all lower than average RBE. And of course, the Epson LS650 has 0 RBE because it uses 3 LCD projection and not DLP. I also assessed laser speckle, which is usually only seen in AAA double laser projectors, and in my experience tends to increase with brightness, and I found that pretty unsurprisingly, the Samsung LPU9D, AWOL LTV3500 Pro, and Hisense PX3-Pro all had the most laser speckle, but not to the point where it was overly distracting or unwatchable. The Nexigo Aurora Pro and Lite, AWOL LTV2500, and BENQ V5010i all had a small amount of laser speckle, and the Dual Light 2.0 engine of the XGIMI Aurora 2 and the single laser projectors had zero laser speckle. And the last two things to cover I understand are very important to some people and not important to all at others. Starting with 3D performance. I tested every projector using the same scenes from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and I judged them based on their 3D effect and, most importantly for me, their eye comfort, because I typically get pretty bad eye fatigue after an hour or so of watching 3D. And what I found was that the Hisense PX3-Pro had a very below average amount of 3D effect and very average eye comfort. The Nexigo Aurora Pro and Lite had an average amount of 3D effect and average eye comfort. The Optima GT3500 HDR had an above average 3D effect but below average eye comfort. The BENQ V5010i, AWOL LTV2500, and AWOL LTV3500 Pro had an above average amount of 3D effect and average eye comfort, and the XGIMI Aurora 2 had by far the best 3D with above average 3D effect and very above average eye comfort, which is something that I've actually experienced before with the XGIMI Horizon Ultra that shares that same Dual Light 2.0 engine and has equally great 3D eye comfort. And to be totally honest, the XGIMI is probably the only one of these projectors that I would choose to watch an entire 3D movie on. But again, my eyes seem to be a little bit more sensitive to the 3D strobing than most people. And last, let's talk speaker quality, which again, I don't think is important to most people since you're probably going to have a surround sound system with your projector, but for completeness, I think the only projector speakers that you wouldn't ever want to use are the Optima GT3500 HDR, which sounds like a classroom projector from the early 2000s. The Nexigo Aurora Pro and Aurora Lite, AWOL LTV2500 and 3500 Pro, Hisense PL1 and Formovie Edge were all capable of getting very loud, but the sound quality wasn't particularly great. The Hisense PX3-Pro and Epson LS650 had decent sound but were a little bit quiet. The BENQ V5010i sounded excellent with a super wide soundstage but had a pretty low peak volume. The Samsung LPU9D was both loud and had good sound, but the best speakers were definitely on the XGIMI Aurora 2, which was not only extremely loud but also had really good low end and a decent soundstage separation. And finally, after all that, it's conclusion time, and we'll start by tallying up all the normalized scores, which makes the winner the BENQ V5010i. That is pretty unexpected, but if you look at the scores, it kind of just did above average in every single category, finishing third for darkroom viewing thanks to good tone mapping and high peak brightness. It finished fifth in bright room viewing. It had good 3D performance, good input lag, good 24p motion handling, great color space coverage and out-of-the-box color accuracy, good speakers, good clarity, and very low fan noise. But having spent well over 100 hours watching these projectors over the last 3 weeks, I personally wouldn't pick the V5010i. Yes, it did finish third in darkroom viewing, but it was miles behind both the Nexigo Aurora Pro and Hisense PX3-Pro in terms of contrast and black floor. It did finish fifth in bright room viewing performance, but again, that was miles behind the Epson LS650 and Samsung LPU9D, and it actually finished behind the Hisense PX3-Pro. And I do think that the BENQ is going to give the AWOL LTV3500 Pro a run for its money as far as the best all-around ultra-short throw projector, especially being priced significantly lower. But unlike the more expensive AWOL, I think that the BENQ is a jack of all trades, master of none, rather than a master of some like the AWOL. For me though, the real standout and the projector that I will personally be switching to is the Hisense PX3-Pro, which finished second for darkroom viewing and fourth in bright room viewing, but suffered in the overall rankings from not passing the ratings 24p test and 3D that's definitely not working correctly yet. And I'd never suggest buying a projector based on updates that may or may not happen, but it seems like both of those things could easily be fixed in a firmware update. For purely darkroom viewing, the Nexigo Aurora Pro is still unbeatable, and top left corner focus seems to be its only downfall. And even though this unit was better than my last one in that regard, it was still much worse than all the other projectors in the video, but basically everything else about the Aurora Pro is amazing. I'd also expected to like the Aurora Lite since it has all the same features and same excellent contrast of the Aurora Pro, but I thought that the lower brightness had a significant effect on the ability to make the highlights pop, and even at its discounted price, I think I'd recommend saving up the extra $500 to $700 to just get the Aurora Pro instead. For purely bright room viewing, the Samsung LPU9D came out slightly on top of the LS650, and if you are made of money and bright room performance is all you care about, then you should go from the Samsung. But for less than half the price of the Samsung, there is a lot to like about the Epson LS650, which is also $500 cheaper than the LS800 that I tested last year, but was actually brighter in dynamic mode according to my measurements. Combine that with good speakers, decent input lag, and zero rainbow effect, and the LS650 makes for the perfect man cave projector for watching big screen sports. The biggest difference between the LS650 and the LS800 is their throw distance, where the LS800 needs just 4.5 inches from the wall for a 100-inch screen versus 11.5 inches for the LS650. But the less extreme throw does make it easier to line up the LS650 without keystone, and it helps with focus. So if you're looking for a light Canon to watch sports, you should pretty much just pick whichever Epson has the better throw ratio for you. If you have a budget between $1,500 and $2,000, I think we're going to see the Aurora Light, Formovie Edge, Hisense PL1, and LTV 2500 dip down into that range this holiday season, and among those more budget projectors, I think that the Formovie Edge is the best option, especially once they add 3D in the December update. As always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, but I do have links for all the projectors for both Amazon and projectorscreen.com down in the description, and as always, I appreciate when you use those links, since as an affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. If you still got questions or I missed something, make sure you leave a comment and I will try to respond to all of them, but if you feel like you need a little bit more guidance, I'd recommend calling the guys at projectorscreen.com and tell them that Rob from The Hookup sent you. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.